Who do you think you are? An old, broke, dark-skinned woman like you doesn't deserve to step into this house." That was Vanessa Carter's icy scream as she shoved me away from the door of the very apartment she and my son were living in off my back. But just a few seconds later, when she confidently swiped her card in front of all her guests and it was declined, that arrogant face froze in place. Because she had no idea that I, Marianne Carter, 63 years old, the woman she treated like garbage, was the legal owner of the loan that her perfect little marriage was built on, and I had just pulled the plug on everything. So tell me, if it were you, would you stay silent and let a disrespectful brat walk all over you? Or would you stand up and expose the truth right in front of them? Would you forgive or make them pay every last price they owe? If you want to watch the wicked fall to their knees, hit subscribe and comment. I will not stay silent. I am Marianne Carter, 63 years old, an African-American woman with the dark skin my mother used to call the color of endurance. I have lived a simple life in an old apartment, going to work and then returning home, raising my son with my own hands. When my husband died early, I told myself I had to be stronger, had to carry both roles so Jason could have a decent future. Every effort pointed toward him, and I always believed that one day when he looked back, he would understand everything I had missed, all the nights I sat alone beside a cold stove, waiting for him to return from late classes. The day Jason invited me to his birthday party, I thought perhaps the distance between us would finally mend. I arrived a little earlier than planned, standing in front of the apartment door I had helped pay for over many years. Inside were laughter, clinking dishes, the kinds of sounds that warm the heart of an old woman like me. I raised my hand to knock, but the door opened before I touched it. Vanessa stood there wearing the coldness she always carried, a face that had never offered me a kind look. She looked at me from head to toe, her eyes skimming over me like an object with no value left. "You really came," Vanessa said, her voice light but every word piercing through me like a sharp needle. I didn't have time to respond. She tilted her head, lowering her voice so each word landed clearly. "We only invited you out of pity, just courtesy. Stay outside, don't make things uncomfortable for everyone." In that moment, the laughter inside fell silent in my mind. I didn't hear anything except the slow, heavy beat of my own heart. I wanted to ask her why she said that, why she looked at me like some stranger she needed to discard, but my throat tightened as if something were wrapped around it. I stood there steadying myself so I wouldn't tremble. What hurt most wasn't her words. It was the sight of Jason appearing behind her, looking at me for a few seconds before turning away and walking back inside without saying anything, without asking if I was all right, without stopping his wife. My son, who once hugged me as a child, who once held my hand on the way to school, now stood still as if I were someone he had never met. It didn't feel like a cut. It felt like trust collapsing in a single breath. Vanessa tilted her head slightly, as if waiting for me to leave. I knew that if I stayed even a few seconds longer, I would break down in front of her. So I simply nodded and stepped back. The sound of the door closing behind me was sharp and final, like sealing off a part of my life. I walked away, keeping my steps straight, though inside, everything felt shattered. No one knew that in that moment, I felt older than my age. I realized I had lived for years hoping to be seen, while the only thing I received was disdain. I wondered where I had gone wrong, how I had raised a son who could watch his mother be humiliated and say nothing. I returned to my small apartment. When I closed the door, the darkness seemed to wrap around me, but it wasn't warm. I sat on the familiar chair and placed my trembling hands on my knees. No tears. I had cried enough in my life to know silence could hurt more than sobbing. In that stillness, I remembered my mother, Martha Carter. She used to say, "Your dignity is the one thing you never let anyone take from you, not even someone you love." Her words returned to me like a thin thread of light cutting through the dark room. I thought of Vanessa, of the way she looked at me as if I were an old shadow clinging to their lives. I thought of Jason, the boy I had poured my entire life into, now turning away when I needed him most, and I felt something shifting inside me, slowly but firmly. The sadness sank, leaving space for a cold, steady clarity. I didn't know that night while I sat alone in my quiet apartment, another door was preparing to open, a door leading to a truth far more painful, but also the only door that would help me see who these people truly were, the ones I had called family. And I told myself this was only the beginning. Within the documents I was about to uncover, there would be things far crueler than the humiliation at that apartment door. But this time, I would not be silent. I was no longer the woman who bowed her head. I just didn't know that the truth waiting ahead of me would be even more devastating than anything I imagined. I returned home after the humiliating night as if someone had drained all the air from my lungs. The old room remained silent, but that silence was heavier than ever. I sat at the edge of the bed, feeling my hands searching for something to hold on to. Everything I once believed about family suddenly felt fragile. My eyes wandered around the room and stopped at the wooden cabinet I rarely touched. In that moment, an instinct tugged at me. I stood up, walked over, opened the cabinet, and saw the brown document box I had forgotten for years. I carried the box to the table and sat down slowly. A part of me didn't want to open it, as if whatever lay inside would crush me further. But another part, stronger, needed to know everything. I opened the lid, a thin layer of dust rising under the warm yellow light. Inside were neatly arranged sets of papers, contracts, receipts, old statements. My heartbeat quickened when I realized many of them had my name on the upper right corner. I picked one up, my hand trembling slightly. It bore my signature, but it wasn't my handwriting. The strokes were jagged, forced, trying to imitate me, but lacking the softness I knew. Under the light, that signature felt like an invisible wound. I flipped through the papers. Each page tightened something inside my chest. My name appeared repeatedly on loan documents and credit papers I had never seen before. I recalled all the moments Jason rushed me to sign simple paperwork, insisting it was just to help them settle their life. I trusted him, trusted the look in my son's eyes, trusted he would never do anything that would hurt his mother. And at that moment, all that trust collapsed like a rock plunging into deep water. I inhaled deeply to steady myself and reached for another stack. They were statements for the account we supposedly shared. Each transaction appeared sharply, coldly. The same withdrawal every month, $500, again and again. And then a long list of payments. Designer bags, cosmetics, expensive restaurants, places I had never heard of. I realized this wasn't a household account. All of that money had vanished into the luxury Vanessa flaunted online. The pain from the previous night hadn't healed, and now it tore open again. I felt the truth creeping in cold and stark. I pictured Vanessa standing at the doorway, the mocking look she wore, as if she was declaring I meant nothing in their lives. But the truth was harsher. I wasn't family to them. I was a resource they could drain at will. Their exploitation wasn't just rooted in contempt, but in calculated cruelty. I sifted through another pile, seeing forged signatures placed beside records of a secondary credit card I never authorized. Everything was tied to a number that wasn't mine. I remembered Vanessa's expensive purchases, her lavish weekends. I once thought they were treating themselves after saving up. Instead, they were siphoning my money while I stretched every dollar to survive. I leaned back in the chair, feeling like a weight had been dropped on my chest. But no tears came. I had shed too many tears over the years, and now all that remained was a spreading coldness. Not numbness, but a sharp clarity, like the edge of a blade. From the papers before me, I understood my life had been manipulated by the people I trusted most, and now I had to reclaim it. The room filled only with the sound of turning pages and my breathing. Those papers painted a truth I had never let myself consider, Jason, and Vanessa saw me as a tool who could sign, deposit, stay silent. I closed the final document, staring at the forged signature for a long moment. Then I placed everything back into the box and pushed it slightly away, as if pushing away the pain I had just uncovered. But instead of hurt, something else rose inside me, a quiet, fierce flame. Every humiliation from the night before gathered into a single razor-sharp thought. I stood, closed the box, and realized the line of my tolerance had dissolved. What happened was no longer about motherly sacrifice. This was about justice, dignity, and my own life. And I would not let anyone step on that life again. In that moment, with my hand resting on the box, I felt myself change. No more softness, no more clinging to hope. Something in me snapped awake, clear and unwavering, like metal striking metal. From that moment on, I was no longer the weak mother. I sat in my living room with the box of documents in front of me, my chest still trembling lightly after everything I had just uncovered. Outside, the afternoon sun slid across the thin glass, making the room feel smaller. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. Then suddenly remembered a name my mother used to mention in her old stories. Someone she trusted completely. Someone I never thought I would need in my life. Langston Moore. I called the number I found in my mother's notebook. A calm, deep male voice answered, as if he had waited years for this call. He asked for my address and said he would come right away. I agreed, unsure what exactly I was stepping into, only knowing I was too tired to fight alone. About an hour later, the doorbell rang. I opened the door and saw a tall man in his 50s, sharp eyes softened by warmth. His clothes were simple, but something about him made me straighten my back. He looked at me for a moment, then nodded. Mary Ann Carter. You look a lot like your mother. That sentence pressed on my chest. I stepped aside and invited him in. In that moment, I realized Langston Moore wasn't a stranger. He was a fragment of my past, a piece of my mother's memory I had set aside without meaning to. I led him to the table where the box still lay open. I told him everything from the night Vanessa humiliated me to the forged signatures I had just found. He listened carefully, eyes following every page I handed him. Sometimes he paused, inspecting a line of text. Sometimes he frowned at a forged signature. He didn't waste a single movement. He looked like a man piecing together a puzzle he had seen too many times in his career. When he finished, he placed the last document on the table and stayed silent for a few seconds. I waited, hands clasped. Then he looked up, his expression sharpened, as though he had just confirmed something grave. Mary Ann, they didn't just take advantage of you, he said, low and steady. They broke the law. My breath hitched. I had sensed this truth, but hearing it from a lawyer was like being jolted awake. Langston pulled the box closer and tapped his fingers on the stack of papers. Forged signatures, misappropriation of assets, opening credit lines without notifying the named party. This is no longer a family issue. This is a prosecutable offense. The room seemed to shift slightly. Not because of fear, because the truth was now undeniable, Jason, and Vanessa had crossed a line they could never return from. I knew your mother very well, Langston continued, his tone gentler. She once told me that if a day ever came when Marianne was in trouble, I had to make sure no one could steal her life from her. My throat tightened. My mother had seen everything I refused to acknowledge, and today, he said slowly, is that day. I looked at him, feeling the atmosphere change. The panic and hurt inside me began to dissolve into something new. I realized I wasn't standing alone anymore. Someone was standing with me, as if my mother had sent him to fight the battle I had endured for far too long. Langston opened his bag, pulled out blank papers and a pen. You need to understand this now. From this moment on, we are not just resisting. We are taking back everything that belongs to you. I couldn't speak. I just watched him write each stroke decisive. The first step, he explained, is requesting full statements of every account under your name. Then we file a report on the forged signatures. Finally, we request a legal review of every loan taken in your name. He laid out each step clearly, methodically, like a strategist who had prepared this plan long before. I felt as if he were lifting me out of quicksand. Every word he said placed another solid stone beneath my feet. I looked at him, my pulse trembling. Not because I was afraid, but because I realized something I had never dared hope for. I had a chance to turn everything around. He set the pen down and met my eyes. Marianne, we're going to make them fall. I heard every syllable. But legally. The sentence dropped into the room like the spark of a storm I had never allowed myself to imagine. In that moment, I felt the entire direction of my life shift, and I knew this was only the beginning. The next morning, I woke up with a strange feeling, as if my body had been placed in a different position. Langston had just left the night before, but his words were still clear in my mind. The forged documents, the drained transactions, the times I had been used in silence, all formed an endpoint that neither Jason nor Vanessa could have imagined. I stood before the mirror, looking into my own eyes, realizing my expression had changed. I no longer waited for someone to save me. I would save myself. I gathered all the documents Langston instructed me to bring, placing them carefully into my bag. The morning light slipped through the crack of the door, cold yet sharp enough to keep me alert. It was time to begin the first step of my counterattack, a quiet step, but heavy like a hammer strike. I drove to the bank where Jason had once insisted I open a joint account. Thinking back, I finally understood why he was so persistent. The glass doors opened, and the cold air from the air conditioning brushed against my skin. I walked straight to the counter. The teller smiled and asked what I needed. "How much would you like to withdraw?" she asked. I looked directly into her eyes, my voice firm. "All of it." She flinched slightly, but continued working, checking my documents. I watched the computer screen as the words "joint account" appeared. A minute later, she placed a confirmation slip and an envelope of cash on the table. "Would you like to close the account as well?" "Yes." As I signed the closure papers, I felt as though I had just cut the last string Jason and Vanessa used to bind me. No one knew what I had just done. No one knew that their source of spending had completely vanished. I stepped out of the bank feeling lighter, but also colder than before. The supplementary credit card Vanessa had been using was next on the list. I called the bank's hotline, reading each number on the card. The agent asked why I wanted to cancel it. I replied briefly, "I want her access removed immediately." The system asked for a final confirmation. I said, "Confirm," and in that moment, I knew Vanessa would feel this like a slap in the face. And I was right. The next morning, while I was making coffee, my phone vibrated nonstop. I glanced at the screen, seeing Jason's name flashing, then Vanessa's, then an unknown number. I didn't answer. I only listened to the flood of notifications, like someone pounding on my door, trying to force their way back into my life. Then came a short text from Jason. "Mom, Vanessa's card didn't work. What happened?" I didn't reply, but I could imagine Vanessa at the counter, her card declined in front of everyone. The cashier giving her an awkward look, and Vanessa probably furious enough to shake. That chaos was only the beginning of what they were about to face. I calmly enjoyed my coffee. For years, I had lived accommodating everyone else's emotions. Now, I allowed myself a peaceful morning, letting them deal with the consequences they created. After breakfast, I took the documents Linkston had marked to a larger bank branch. I requested to meet the credit department manager. After a short wait, I was led into an office. The manager skimmed through my documents, then looked up at me in surprise. "You want to request full liquidation of the loan under your name and a legal audit of the original contract?" "Yes," I replied. "But if the loan isn't paid on time, the primary borrowers will have their property repossessed." "I understand." He looked at me longer than necessary, as if checking that I was truly certain, but there was no hesitation left in me. He signed the intake form and closed the folder. From this moment, the process is activated. When the legal team verifies the forged signatures, everything will progress faster than expected. I nodded, collected the copies, and left the room in a silence that felt like the beginning march of a war. As I stepped outside, the wind blew harder than it had in the morning. I pulled my coat closer, but my hands still trembled slightly from the strange energy rising within me. It wasn't fear. It was determination strong enough that I felt taller than my old self yesterday. When I settled back into my car, I realized this. I had gone too far to turn back, and the realization made my heart feel lighter. On the drive home, my phone vibrated again. I left it buried in my bag. Every vibration was proof that they were feeling the consequences of what I had silently set into motion. When my car stopped in front of my house, sunlight angled through the windshield, shining straight into my face. I closed my eyes for a moment, inhaled deeply, then stepped out. I had begun, and I would not stop. That afternoon, the sky turned heavy gray, like a sheet of lead pressed over the roof. I had just placed the folder on the table when the phone began ringing, its sound sharp and relentless. I stared at the screen, watching Jason's name flash again and again. The ringing rose, stopped, then rose once more, like a storm pounding on the fragile peace I had barely begun to rebuild. I stood still for a few seconds, feeling the chaos from his side of the line rushing toward me, even before I picked up. On the sixth call, I answered. "Mom, don't do this," Jason shouted the moment the call connected, his breath uneven. "They said if you don't withdraw the request, we'll lose the house. Vanessa is losing her mind. You're destroying our lives." I held the phone, letting his words hit my ears, but nothing inside me moved. It was as if a thick pane of glass had settled between his voice and my heart. I pressed the phone closer, yet my own voice came out steady, colder than I expected. "Jason, I'm not destroying anything. I'm protecting what is mine, the things you two took from me." There was silence on the other end. Then Jason let out a strangled laugh. "Took from you? Are you serious? We only borrowed it. We were going to pay you back. You can't push us to the edge over something so small." "Something small?" I repeated, my tone dropping. "Forging my signature, using my name to take out loans, draining every dollar I put in that account so your wife could spend freely? That's what you call small?" I heard a crash in the background, likely Vanessa throwing something. Jason hurriedly spoke again, voice trembling. Mom, I'm sorry. We were wrong, but you have to understand, if you keep going, we'll have nowhere to go. I'm close to losing my job. I can't pay the fines. I'm begging you, stop this. I closed my eyes. A thin, thread-like pain passed through me, but left no trace. All these years, I had saved him from everything. Every mistake he made, I carried. Every debt I helped cover. And now, when I stood up to protect myself, he called it destruction. My voice was low, sharp as metal. Jason, when you took everything from me, did you ever think about who would save me? I'll fix this, I promise, he yelled. Just withdraw the request. I'll kneel if I have to. I paused. I remembered him as a little boy, crying after falling off his bike and running into my arms. I once believed no pain could hurt me more than seeing him hurt. But now, the pain wasn't in his pleas. It was in the absence he had shown me for years. Jason, I said, if you're scared, it's because you finally understand what consequences feel like. His breath broke into fragments on the other line. You talk like this is justified. You think the law will protect you. I am your son. You're supposed to stand by me. You are my son, I replied, but you haven't stood by me for a very long time. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then Jason's voice tightened, turning into something darker, a mix of desperation and anger. Fine, if that's what you want, then hear me clearly. If you let this happen, I swear I will hate you for the rest of my life. The words pierced my chest like a cold blade. But my heart did not collapse. I realized this was not the first cut, only the final one that closed every illusion I had left. Jason had spoken aloud what he had held inside for years, waiting for the chance to throw it in my face. I pulled the phone away, staring at the screen without trembling. Jason was still speaking, but I no longer heard him. I tapped end call, then placed the phone quietly on the table. Outside the window, the wind shook the branches violently. Inside me, a final shell cracked away. I walked across the room to steady my breathing. In that silence, I heard something clearly. What Jason said did not break me. It freed me. The afternoon dragged on in a heavy silence, so still that I thought the storm from Jason had finally died down. But then a loud noise burst from the hallway, sharp and heavy, like a bell announcing a new wave of chaos. I walked closer to the door, looked through the peephole. Vanessa was standing there, her hair messy, mascara streaked down her cheeks, both hands pounding on the door like someone losing their mind. Her eyes were bloodshot, filled with rage and desperation, as if her world was crumbling right beneath her feet. I didn't open the door, but I didn't step back either. I let my presence sit firmly behind the wooden barrier so she could feel it. Vanessa burst into loud sobs, screaming each broken sentence. You ruined our lives. You disgust me. You don't deserve to be a mother, do you hear me? Her voice was sharp, like a short knife, each word thrown forward as if trying to pierce through the space. I leaned against the wall, my gaze cold, sensing clearly that her screaming was nothing more than pure fear. Fear of losing the house, fear of losing money, not fear of losing a person. Her sobs dragged on, but I couldn't find a trace of genuine tears. It was desperation, rehearsed, a performance meant to shake me. For years, voices like that made me soften. But now, everything had changed. A louder bang erupted this time from Jason slamming his hand into the door. "Mom, open the door," he shouted. "I'm going to lose everything. Stop being so cruel." I stared at the door, watched it tremble slightly under each strike, and my heart settled into a strange clarity. I placed my hand on the doorknob, not turning it, just holding it for a breath before speaking through the wood between us. No, Jason. You ruined your own life. I just stopped rescuing you. Outside, everything went silent for a second, as if neither of them expected me to say that. Jason was used to me backing down. Vanessa was used to me staying quiet. Both of them were used to my obedience. They never imagined the day this door would stand firm against their screams. Then Vanessa's voice rose again, sharper, almost screeching like nails dragging across glass. What do you want from us, huh? You want us to kneel at your feet. You want to show off your little power? You want revenge? I answered slowly, each word heavy like stone. What I want is fairness. What I need is respect. Jason slammed the door again, this time harder, wilder. Listen to me, I lost my job. The card got shut down, the account is closed, and now you're asking for loan liquidation? How are we supposed to live? Do you want us dead? I closed my eyes, listening to the sound of his broken breath. It wasn't the voice of a son pleading for help, but the voice of a man terrified of losing his privileges, terrified of living on his own terms rather than spending someone else's money, terrified of Vanessa turning her anger toward him. I opened my eyes and spoke clearly. You'll live the way you were meant to live, Jason, outside the crying and pounding, blended into a chaotic symphony, a mixture of begging, threatening, blaming, and screaming. If I were the mother I used to be, I would have broken into pieces between those sounds. But today, I stood firm. Vanessa's voice cracked, then rose again with venom. You think you're somebody, huh? You think you have the right to destroy our lives? You're just an old woman surviving on your son's money. I let out a cold, quiet laugh that they couldn't see. I live on the money I earn, Vanessa. Whose money do you live on? The hallway fell silent for a few seconds. I knew the words had landed right where it hurt most. Vanessa held her breath a moment, as if someone had gripped her throat, then burst into tears again, louder than before. Jason jumped back in, his voice shaking with both anger and panic. Mom, she can't take this anymore. You really want this family destroyed? I rested my head against the wall, listening to their frantic desperation without feeling my heart waver. I had been destroyed long ago. They were only now tasting what they had served. Something crashed outside, maybe a decorative pot Vanessa kicked over. Her voice twisted, contorted with rage. If you don't withdraw the filing, we'll drag you to court. The threat, instead of frightening me, made me straighten my back. I looked at the door as if looking straight at their faces. The court date arrived faster than I expected. The sky was bright, but my heart was thick with an indescribable feeling, as if every step I took down the courthouse hallway carried the weight of an entire lifetime of being pushed aside. Jason and Vanessa stood on the other side, avoiding my eyes. Vanessa wore light makeup, but the powder couldn't hide the dark circles beneath her eyes. Jason tried to maintain a calm expression, yet his hands clenched so tightly they turned pale. I took my seat and looked up when Langston approached, resting a hand on my shoulder in reassurance. His gaze was calm but razor-sharp, as though he had walked into hundreds of battles like this and knew exactly which direction the wind was blowing today. When the hearing began, the atmosphere shifted instantly. The gavel struck with a heavy, sharp sound. The judge looked at each of us, then opened the file. Her eyes were so piercing, I felt that any word spoken would be dissected layer by layer. Langston stood first, straightened his tie, then stepped to the podium. He opened the folder, pulling out every document I had given him, each piece of evidence that had once made my hands shake when I discovered it. Your Honor, Langston began, his voice clear and steady, this is the forged signature of my client. He placed enlarged copies onto the display board. The fake signatures appeared under the lights, the ink strokes crooked, forced, and awkward, trying desperately to imitate my handwriting. The courtroom tightened. Jason lowered his head even more. Vanessa blinked repeatedly, trying to stay composed but failing. Langston continued, here are the statements from the joint account with a monthly withdrawal of exactly $500. All made using the supplementary card under Vanessa Carter's name without written consent from my client. He pointed at each transaction, every number displayed plainly. Lavish expenses, designer items, fine dining, trips, all paid with the money I had deposited. Langston culled another document, and this is the $250,000 loan contract signed using Marianne Carter's identity without her awareness or approval. This constitutes identity theft and financial fraud. The courtroom fell into silence, a silence so deep I could hear someone breathing in the back row. The judge narrowed her eyes, turning to Vanessa and Jason like they were two animals cornered under a spotlight they never expected to face. Jason leaned forward, wanting to speak, but his lawyer tugged him back. Vanessa, who had held herself upright from the start, began to tremble at the final document. The judge spoke, her voice low but commanding. Miss Vanessa Carter? Do you have anything to say in your defense? Vanessa swallowed hard, her eyes darting around the room in search of an escape. She opened her mouth, but her voice fractured into broken pieces. I only wanted a better life. I didn't think things would go this far. Her voice cracked. She lifted her hand to wipe her tears, but it trembled so violently she missed her cheek. Jason turned toward her, panic written across his face. For the first time, I saw their truth fully exposed. Not love, not family, just two people leaning on each other to cover their greed. The judge closed the file and placed it on the desk. She looked at them as though seeing through every mask. Miss Vanessa Carter, she said, every word striking like metal against stone. The evidence leaves no room for denial. Your actions are not minor errors. They are deliberate acts of fraud. Vanessa let out a sharp sob, and Jason's shoulders collapsed as if drained of all strength. A quiet ache rippled through me, but it wasn't for them. It was for what I had lost for years and what I had now finally reclaimed, respect for myself. The judge glanced back at the documents and delivered her verdict. Vanessa Carter, you are convicted of financial fraud and identity theft. The gavel struck. The gavel struck, and the courtroom fell into a silence so heavy every breath felt sharp. Vanessa stood frozen, her eyes wide as if staring into a void, while Jason lowered his head, his hands trembling. I stayed seated, my expression unchanged, not because I felt numb, but because everything happening now was the truth they finally had to face, the truth they had avoided for years, leaving too many invisible wounds on my shoulders. The judge flipped to the final page of the verdict, her voice steady and clear as she read each line of punishment. The words fell into the room like stones. Vanessa Carter, sentenced to 2 years of probation. At that, Vanessa's knees weakened, as though someone had drained every last bit of strength from her body. A strangled sob escaped her lips, but the judge did not look up. She continued reading. 300 hours of community service to be completed at the local community center. I saw Jason glance toward Vanessa, his eyes flickering between pity and fear. They had never imagined their lives would crash this low. The judge paused briefly before reading the next line. suspension from the event planning industry for 5 years. This time, Vanessa gasped for breath as if something had tightened around her throat. I knew the event industry was the ladder she wanted to climb to elevate her status. Now, this blow to her career was far more devastating than any financial penalty. The judge leaned forward and continued, "Mandatory financial restitution to Mrs. Marianne Carter." I kept my hands on my lap, neither clenching nor trembling. Every word passed through me with a calmness I didn't know I possessed. And then the final sentence descended like a clean, sharp blade, ending a dark chapter. A 10-year credit blacklist. No credit checks, loans, or financial contracts will be approved during this period. Vanessa covered her face, her sobs echoing through the courtroom. No one spoke on her behalf, not even her attorney. I looked at her, a woman who once wore pride like armor, now stripped bare amid the ruins she built herself. When the session adjourned, Jason rose slowly, his steps unsteady. I could clearly see the panic rising in the eyes that once held so much arrogance. When he turned toward me, all the anger and blame had vanished, replaced by fear he couldn't hide. "Why? Why did everything become like this?" Jason whispered, as if asking himself. But the answer was already there. My silence made him turn away. There was no pleading, no rage, only a young man confronted with the consequences he had created, unable to escape them. Langston approached and signaled that we could leave, but as I stood, I heard murmurs from behind. A group of Jason's friends who once laughed loudly whenever I visited him now looked at him differently. No respect, no trust, only caution. Jason noticed it and his face paled. Some walked away, others avoided his gaze. One leaned to whisper softly, yet sharp enough for me to hear, "Don't get involved with them anymore, too much trouble." Jason staggered. He looked around, seeing friends pull away, coworkers glaring, and then receiving a message from his company requesting a re-evaluation of his creditworthiness before renewing his contract. I walked past him without a word. I had spoken enough, and he never listened. Now, reality would do what my voice never could. Behind me, I heard Vanessa's sandals scraping across the floor as she approached the judge to sign acknowledgement of her sentence. Her face blotched red, mascara streaked down her cheeks, lips trembling. She tried saying something, but the judge remained expressionless. Just as I reached the door, the judge's voice rang out again. "One more item." I turned. Vanessa froze, eyes widening. A restraining order. For 1 year, Vanessa Carter is prohibited from contacting, approaching, or coming within 500 feet of Mrs. Marianne Carter. Vanessa's shoulders shook violently, but the judge was not finished. And according to the official notice from the State Event Association, Vanessa Carter is permanently blacklisted from the event industry. But gavel struck again. I left the courthouse that day with a feeling difficult to name. Not victory, not satisfaction. More like an emptiness being cleared out, as if the heaviest part of my life had just been lifted off my shoulders. After weeks of struggle, after suffocating confrontations, after a draining trial and judgmental stares, the thing I longed for most was a place to breathe. And so I decided to return to my mother's old house in the suburbs, the place that held the most beautiful years before life began pressing down on me. The small house sat on a hillside, the old bricks covered in a thin layer of moss, yet every brick reminded me of my mother. She used to sit on the porch, sipping tea, telling me to live strong, not letting anyone define my worth. I stepped through the door, placed my hand on the wall, and felt a quiet peace seep into my veins. The house had few belongings, and the familiar scent of old wood wrapped around me like an embrace. For the first time in many months, I inhaled deeply without feeling a tightness in my chest. I began arranging each corner, starting with the living room. I placed my mother's favorite chair by the window where the morning light touched beautifully. Then I moved to the kitchen where the lingering memory of her Saturday baking seemed to hover. I didn't cry, nor did I tremble. I simply walked through each room, slowly realizing I was returning to myself. A Marianne Carter, unpulled by fear, unharmed by exploitation, no longer forced to sacrifice until empty. The first mornings there were gentle, peaceful, enough for me to hear the wind slip through the trees out back. I brewed a cup of coffee, sat on the wooden porch, and watched the sunrise cut across the horizon. I planted rows of flowers along the path, seeds my mother had kept in a small tin box. I remembered her smiling, saying, "Flowers bloom when they're meant to people too." Each afternoon, I watered the plants, read a few pages, then sat still to listen to the sounds of the earth. I was surprised by how quickly peace arrived. A month earlier, my life was full of shouting, legal documents, and harsh phone calls. Now the only thing startling me was the sound of a woodpecker or a gust of wind knocking the door lightly. I realized peace was not something given, but something I had to choose. One late afternoon, as the sun stretched across the mountains, I sat alone in the quiet house and thought about the long path behind me. My mother's voice echoed in my mind like a thread pulling me back to what I lost. "All my life, I forgot how much I deserve to be respected," I said softly. The words slipped out gentle as a breath, but carrying the weight of years of suppression. And I felt something glowing inside, something I thought I'd lost. Langston visited occasionally. He brought pastries, a few potted plants, then sat with me for hours on the porch. He said I looked healthier, that my eyes seemed brighter. I smiled, knowing he was right. In this silence, I was retrieving pieces of myself, pieces I once believed were crushed beyond repair. I set new boundaries for my life, boundaries I once never knew where to draw. I stopped living to please anyone. I stopped hoping Jason would change. I stopped blaming myself for the mistakes of others, and I allowed myself to live a life not bound to a single role of mother. I once believed that if I stopped saving Jason, he would lose direction, but now I understood that if I kept saving him, we would both drown. That peace stretched for weeks, like a gentle layer covering the rawest parts of me. But peace doesn't last forever when something unresolved still lingers. And that unresolved thing found me one evening. Just as I turned off the stove, my phone lit up in the dark. I didn't recognize the number. But when I opened the message, my heartbeat changed. It was Jason. "Mom, I'm sorry. I want to talk. I know I was wrong. Please answer me." I stared at the sentence for a long time. Something stirred inside. Not pain, not softness, just a quiet stillness, as if I stood at the crossroads of a new chapter. I placed the phone face down on the table. I wasn't ready to step back into an old wound. That morning was strangely clear. Sunlight fell softly on the porch where I sat brewing my usual cup of coffee. Since I moved back to my mother's old house, my life had become a new stream, clear and calmer. But today, when I heard footsteps climbing the wooden steps, my heart tightened for a moment. I knew who was standing outside before the door even opened. Jason. My son stood there, thinner, with dark circles under his eyes, his hand gripping the edge of his jacket pocket as if holding on to something fragile. "Mom," Jason called softly. No anger, no accusation, only exhaustion and remorse. His voice was hoarse, like he had spent nights without sleep. "I'm sorry." I set the cup down, looking at the child I once carried, the child I held when he shook from thunder, the child I walked to school on freezing winter mornings. Now he stood before me like a man worn down by the weight of his own choices. A part of me hurt, but another part had grown too tired to keep holding on. "Jason," I said slowly, "I forgive you." A few seconds passed in silence, and I watched his face collapse. He stepped forward, but I raised a hand to stop him. "But I'm not coming back." Jason froze. I looked into his eyes, seeing a small spark of hope extinguish. My life had drained away from waiting for him to understand how much a mother matters. But apologies come too late when everything has already drifted too far. I no longer had the strength to return to a life where I was dismissed, where I was a foundation for others to step on. Jason bowed his head for a long moment, then stepped back. "I understand," he whispered. "I don't deserve for you to come back, but thank you for forgiving me." I nodded. He turned away, descending the steps with a shadow that made even the breeze sag. And I knew the moment that door closed behind him was the last boundary I needed to cross to free my life completely. In the months that followed, I began writing the final chapter of my life with a freedom I had never known. I took up pottery. At first, they were clumsy, heavy lumps of clay, but week by week, they softened, rounded, warmed beneath my palms. Every time I touched the wheel, I felt as if I were shaping myself anew. I made friends with kind neighbors. They invited me for tea, shared freshly baked bread. We talked about simple things, never debts, never old wounds. I realized I had lived too long among harsh voices, forgetting the world could be gentle. Langston visited more often. He never spoke about the trial unless I brought it up. Instead, he brought potted plants, philosophy books I once thought I had no patience for. We sat on the porch talking about my mother, about their loud arguments over who was better at dominoes. My heart softened through every story, every rare smile I allowed myself. Strength returned in quiet waves. I rebuilt the boundaries of my life, boundaries I used to leave open. I stopped trying to please anyone. I stopped expecting Jason to change. I stopped carrying guilt that was never mine. And I opened myself to a life no longer tied to the single role of mother. For years, I feared Jason would lose his way if I stopped saving him. Now I understood if I kept saving him, we would both lose ourselves. Peace stretched through weeks like a cool wind brushing over the most painful parts of me. But peace never lasts if something unfinished remains. And that unfinished peace reached me one evening. When I turned off the stove, my phone lit up in the dark. I didn't recognize the number, but when I opened the message, my heart shifted. It was Jason. "Mom, I'm sorry. I want to talk. I know I was wrong. Please answer me." I stared at the message for a long time. Something stirred. Not pain, not weakness, a stillness, as if I was standing at the crossroads of a new chapter. I placed the phone face down. I wasn't ready to walk back into an old scar. I left the phone silent, the screen dimming, knowing that whether I responded or not would decide the final fate of this story.